The sky over the private cemetery was a bruised canvas of deep purples and cold charcoal, heavy with the promise of a storm that refused to break. Beneath the oppressive canopy of clouds, Junho Park, the man whose name was whispered in the corridors of power like a death sentence, was a ghost of himself. His tailored black suit, worth more than the lives of the soldiers he commanded, was ruined, the knees soaked through with the freezing, muddy sludge of the cemetery earth. He didn't care. The Iron King of the soul underworld was no longer a king. He was a hollowed-out shell, his posture collapsed inward as if the very air around him had turned to lead. His hands, usually steady enough to execute a man without a tremor, were buried in his face, his fingers digging into his skin to anchor himself against the waves of unadulterated despair. The sound that escaped him was visceral, a low, ragged keening that tore through the suffocating silence of the graveyard. It was a sound that subverted every legend ever told about him. This was the man who had negotiated treaties with blood and silenced dissent with a single, mercury-cold glance, now reduced to a shivering wreck in the dirt. A few yards away, the granite headstone stood like a silent executioner. Its surface was polished to a mirror sheen, reflecting the flickering blue and red of the distant police lights that blurred at the cemetery's edge. The portrait mounted on the stone showed Elena as she had been just days ago, vibrant, luminous, her black American features softened by a calm, knowing expression that had always been Junho's only sanctuary. But the granite was cracked. A sharp, serrated fissure ran down the upper left side, a visual metaphor for the fractured reality Junho now inhabited. He reached out, his knuckles white, tracing the deeply carved serif letters of her name. The scent of white lilies, sickeningly sweet and heavy in the stagnant air, filled his lungs until he felt he might gag on the perfection of her funeral. He had sworn to protect her from the darkness of his world, to keep the violence outside the walls of their home. Instead, the darkness had found her in the one place he thought was safe. As the first heavy drop of rain struck the cracked stone, Junho's breath hitched in a sob that felt like a physical agony, a crushing pressure that made his vision blur into a steel-blue haze. He was so consumed by the abyss of his own grief that he didn't feel the weight of a gaze upon him. He didn't see the shadow shifting behind the thick trunk of a nearby oak tree. There, partially obscured by the dim lighting and the encroaching mist, stood a woman in dark, modern clothing. Her expression was not one of grief, but of intense, calculating focus. She watched the man on his knees, her silhouette a mirror image of the portrait on the grave, waiting for the exact moment the king would truly break. The rain began to fall in earnest now, thick, heavy drops that blurred the line between the sky and the sodden earth. From behind the gnarled trunk of a centuries-old oak tree, Elena stood as still as the monuments surrounding her. Her dark jacket was slick with moisture, her breathing shallow and controlled, a stark contrast to the shattered man collapsing just 50 yards away. Watching Junho weep was like watching a mountain crumble. In all their years together, through the wars with the triads and the cold betrayals of the syndicate, she had never seen him break. He was the anchor, the iron, the man who stayed upright when the world turned to ash. Seeing him now, his forehead pressed against the cold granite of her headstone, Elena felt a sharp, stabbing pain in her chest that had nothing to do with the poison that had nearly claimed her life. Every ragged gasp he drew seemed to pull the air from her own lungs. She had come here with a heart hardened by suspicion, her mind a frantic loop of the moment the tea had touched her lips. The bitter almond, scent of cyanide had been her last conscious memory before the darkness took her, and in the terrifying void of her recovery, a singular thought had poisoned her spirit. Did Junho finally decide I was a liability? But a man does not mourn like this for a strategic removal. A man does not claw at the dirt of a grave he ordered filled. She watched as he reached out to touch the black and white portrait mounted on the stone, his fingers trembling with a reverence that bordered on holy. The police lights in the distance flickered like dying stars, casting long, distorted shadows across the lawn. Elena tightened her grip on the rough bark of the oak. She wanted to scream his name, to run through the mud and pull his head to her chest, to tell him that the coroner's secret antidote had worked. But the shadow of Kenji and Hana loomed larger than the cemetery gates. If she moved now, if she revealed the ghost too early, she wouldn't just be saving Junho, she would be signing both of their death warrants. A low roll of thunder shook the ground beneath her boots. Elena's eyes narrowed, her gaze shifting from her grieving husband to the perimeter of the graveyard. She knew the vultures were watching. She could almost feel the cold, calculating eyes of Kenji's scouts lingering in the mist, waiting for the king to be weak enough to strike. She wasn't just a wife watching a funeral anymore. She was a specter at the edge of a battlefield. As Junho let out one final, soul-crushing cry that was lost to the wind, Elena stepped further into the shadows of the oak. The woman who had been the heart of the empire was gone, replaced by a phantom with a singular, lethal purpose. She would let him mourn a little longer, but soon she would give him something better than peace. She would give him a war. The memory of the betrayal tasted like bitter almonds and cold copper. It hit Elena now, sharper than the rain, pulling her back to the candlelit stillness of their penthouse 3 nights ago. She remembered the porcelain cup in her hand, the delicate steam rising from the herbal tea Hana had prepared with such practiced, sisterly care. Hana had spoken of stress and the weight of the crown, her voice a soothing melody as she watched Elena take that final, fatal sip. Within seconds, the world had tilted. The air in the room had turned to lead, and Elena's heart had stuttered, a frantic bird trapped behind her ribs before slowing to a rhythmic, agonizing throb. She remembered looking up, her vision blurring, to see Kenji leaning against the doorframe. He wasn't wearing his usual mask of loyalty. His face was a map of cold, hungry ambition. He hadn't reached out to catch her as she slumped from the velvet chair. He had simply checked his gold watch, noting the time of her departure with the clinical indifference of a man checking a train schedule. But the darkness hadn't been absolute. She remembered the cold air of the morgue, the sterile scent of formaldehyde, and the sudden, jarring shock of a needle piercing her thigh. Dr. Eris, the syndicate's lead coroner, had been hovering over her, his hands shaking as he injected the concentrated thiosulfate. He was a man who owed his life to Elena. She had settled his gambling debts and moved his family out of the Triad's reach years ago, and that night, he had cashed in his soul to pay her back. "Don't move," he had whispered, his face inches from hers as her lungs suddenly flared with agonizing life. "Your pulse is a ghost, Elena. I've logged the heart failure. I've signed the certificate. If Kenji finds out you breathed again, he'll burn this building with both of us." Inside, he had hidden her in the cold storage, a living woman amongst the silent dead, while the syndicate prepared the grand facade of her funeral. He had explained the antidote's price. She would have to stay dead. She would have to watch the man she loved descend into madness, unable to reach out, unable to comfort him, until the traitors felt secure enough to expose their flank. The rain lashed against the oak tree, snapping Elena back to the present. The phantom taste of the tea lingered on her tongue, a reminder of the fragility of the life she had once led. She looked at Junho, still anchored to the mud, and felt the cold fire of the coroner's needle all over again. The price of her survival was this moment of shared agony, but as she watched Kenji's black sedan pull up to the cemetery gates in the distance, she knew the investment was about to pay off. The tea had been meant to end her story. Instead, it had merely changed the genre. The transition of power was as silent and lethal as a blade through silk. In the high-rise heart of Seoul, the elevator doors of the syndicate's headquarters chimed with a cold, mechanical precision, announcing a new era. Kenji stepped out into the executive lobby, his stride lacking the heavy, rhythmic authority of Junho's, replaced instead by the frantic, hungry energy of a man who had waited too long in the shadows. He didn't look at the guards, men who had sworn oaths to his cousin, but they felt the shift in the air. The atmosphere was no longer thick with the steady, mountain-like presence of the Iron King. It was sharp with the scent of ozone and impending lightning. Kenji reached the double mahogany doors of the primary office and paused. For a moment, he simply stared at the ornate brass handles, his reflection caught in the polished wood. Behind him, Hana followed, her heels clicking against the marble like the ticking of a countdown clock. She clutched a leather-bound folder to her chest, her eyes scanning the hallway with the clinical detachment of an architect surveying a building she had already decided to burn down. With a slow, deliberate movement, Kenji pushed the doors open. The office was exactly as Junho had left it, dimly lit, smelling of aged scotch and the lingering ghost of Elena's expensive perfume. The chair behind the massive obsidian desk was empty, a silent testament to the man currently kneeling in the mud of a cemetery miles away. To Kenji, the chair wasn't just furniture, it was a throne, and its emptiness was an invitation. He walked toward it, his eyes fixed on the view of the city sprawling beneath the window. He didn't hesitate. He sat. The leather groaned under his weight, a sound that seemed to echo through the stillness of the room. He leaned back, resting his polished shoes on the desk, right next to the framed photograph of Junho and Elena on their wedding day. With the tip of his boot, Kenji nudged the frame, watching it slide across the obsidian surface until it teetered on the edge and fell. The sound of glass shattering on the floor was the only coronation ceremony he required. "The clan heads are restless, Kenji," Hannah said, her voice cutting through the silence. She didn't look at the broken glass. She moved to the side of the desk, laying out a series of digital tablets. "They see Junho's public breakdown as a terminal infection. If we don't move to consolidate the accounts by dawn, the vacuum will pull in the triads." Kenji let out a short, jagged laugh, his fingers tracing the edge of the desk where Junho's hands had rested for a decade. "Let them be restless. My cousin is busy talking to a rock in a graveyard. He's already dead. He just hasn't realized he's stopped breathing yet." He looked up at Hannah, his eyes bright with a dangerous, unchecked fervor. "Transfer the primary security codes to my biometric signature. By the time Junho wipes the mud off his knees, there won't be a single door in this city that opens for him." The penthouse was a tomb of silence, the air heavy with the scent of expensive scotch and the lingering, ghostly trail of Elena's favorite perfume. Junho sat in the darkness, a shadow among shadows, his silhouette framed against the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a soul that continued to pulse with life as if his world hadn't ended. He was still in his suit, the dried mud of the cemetery a crusty reminder of his humiliation. He looked at his hands, the hands that had built an empire, and saw only the dirt that remained. He was a man waiting for the end, his eyes fixed on the distant lights of the city he no longer cared to rule. Then, the vibration cut through the stillness. It wasn't his primary phone, nor was it the burner used for syndicate business. It was a low, rhythmic hum coming from the top drawer of his obsidian desk. Junho froze, his breath catching in his throat. Slowly, with fingers that felt like lead, he opened the drawer. There, glowing with a soft, blue luminescence in the dark, was Elena's personal phone, an encrypted device that should have been silent forever. The caller ID displayed no number, only a single emoji, a white lily. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, painful rhythm. Part of him wanted to hurl the device across the room, to protect the fragile remains of his sanity from a cruel prank. But the pull was magnetic. He swiped the screen with a trembling thumb and pressed the cold glass to his ear. He didn't hear a voice. There was no breathing, no whispered confession, no taunt from a hidden enemy. Instead, there was music. It was faint, filtered through layers of digital encryption, but the melody was unmistakable. It was the slow, soulful jazz of the song they had danced to at their wedding, a rare, private recording of a Black American blues singer they had discovered in a small club in New Orleans. It was their sanctuary song, the piece of music that existed only for the two of them, far away from the blood and the iron of the syndicate. "Elena," he whispered, his voice a jagged wreck of hope and terror. The music continued, the mournful brass notes wailing through the line like a plea from the afterlife. For a moment, the crushing weight of the grief vanished, replaced by a cold, electric clarity. This wasn't a glitch. This wasn't a haunting. It was a signal. The music swelled, a specific crescendo they used to joke was their call to arms, before the line went abruptly dead. Junho sat in the renewed silence, the blue light of the phone fading. The despair that had anchored him to the mud of the graveyard was gone, replaced by a terrifying, focused heat. He looked at the broken glass of the wedding portrait on the floor, then up at the empty chair where Kenji had sat just hours before. The Iron King didn't need a crown to be dangerous. He only needed a reason to believe in the impossible. And for the first time in 3 days, Junho Park began to breathe again. The clinical silence of the syndicate's financial hub was usually Hannah's sanctuary. Here, amidst the soft hum of cooling fans and the steady glow of triple monitor setups, she felt like a god, moving millions across borders with a single keystroke. But tonight, the air in the room felt unnaturally thin. Hannah sat at her desk, the blue light of the screens reflecting in her glasses, her fingers hovering over the keys. She was halfway through the final consolidation of Junho's offshore assets, the last nail in the coffin of the old regime, when the first glitch appeared. It started as a flicker, a momentary lapse in the scrolling lines of code. Then a window opened unbidden. It was an encrypted account, one so deeply buried that only she and Junho knew of its existence. Her heart gave a sharp, painful thud as she watched the ledger begin to move. The numbers were tumbling, not into the new shell company she had established for Kenji, but outward, flowing through a series of ghost servers she couldn't track. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice cracking in the empty room. She threw her weight into the keyboard, her fingers flying in a desperate attempt to initiate a firewall. Access denied. She tried again, her pulse hammering in her ears. Access denied. Then, the center monitor went black, replaced by a single line of text in a clean, serif font that made her blood turn to ice. A gift for those who remember. Hannah's breath hitched as she watched her secure accounts, the ones holding the bribes for the clan heads and the payroll for their mercenary guards, begin to drain with terrifying efficiency. The destination fields on the screen began to populate with names she hadn't seen in years. A local orphanage Elena had championed, a scholarship fund for inner-city youth, and the medical clinic where Elena had volunteered. It was a digital execution. Thousands, then hundreds of thousands, then millions of dollars vanished into the void of charity, stripped from the syndicate's war chest in a matter of seconds. Hannah grabbed the edges of her desk, her knuckles white, her vision blurring with a sudden, overwhelming paranoia. It was impossible. Elena was in the ground. She had seen the body, had watched the light leave those eyes. Suddenly, the speakers on her desk crackled to life. It wasn't the sound of static. It was the soft, rhythmic hum of a woman's voice, a low, melodic tune Elena used to hum when she was working late into the night. The sound was so intimate, so proximity-sharp, that Hannah spun around, certain she would see a shadow standing in the doorway. There was no one. Only the cold, flickering blue light of the monitors and the sight of her power crumbling into zeros. As the final account hit a balance of nothing, the screens pulsed once and displayed a black and white portrait. Elena, smiling that calm, knowing smile. Hannah backed away from the desk, her chair clattering to the floor as the realization set in. The ghost wasn't just in the machine. The ghost was coming for them all. The outskirts of Seoul were a jagged landscape of rusted skeletons and abandoned industry, a place where the city's pulse went to die. Junho steered his sedan through the skeletal remains of the old iron mill, the tires crunching over gravel and broken glass. Every instinct he possessed, honed by a decade of surviving the unthinkable, screamed that this was an execution. A midnight meeting at a derelict site was the oldest play in the book, the standard ritual for a king whose time had run out. Yet, the music from the phone, that singular, soulful jazz melody, had acted like a hook in his heart, dragging him toward the center of the trap. He stepped out of the car, the engines ticking the only sound in the cavernous silence. The air inside the mill was thick with the scent of oxidized metal and ancient dust. He didn't draw his weapon. If an assassin was waiting in the rafters, a gun wouldn't save a man who had already lost his reason to live. He walked deeper into the belly of the mill, past rusted turbines that looked like sleeping giants, toward a single, flickering light at the far end of the hall. The space was hollow and cold, the moonlight filtering through the shattered skylights in long, ghostly fingers. Then he saw her. A figure stood in the center of the floor, framed by the skeletal remains of a massive iron press. She was dressed in dark, tactical clothing, her silhouette sharp against the moonlight. Junho's heart stopped, a physical blow that left him gasping. He stayed rooted to the spot, his mind warring with his eyes. The grief was so absolute that he feared his brain had finally fractured, conjuring a phantom from his deepest longing.
"Junho," she said.
The voice wasn't a whisper or a dream. It was rich, warm, and grounded in reality, carrying the unmistakable cadence of the woman who had been his only peace. She stepped forward into the light. The bruised gray palette of the mill seemed to sharpen as her features became clear. Elena stood before him, her eyes searching his face with a mixture of fierce love and agonizing caution. She looked for the lie in his expression, the shadow of a betrayal she had feared was hers to carry. But all she saw was a man being reborn in a single, shattering moment of realization. He moved then, his legs heavy and slow at first, as if walking through deep water, before breaking into a desperate stride. He reached her in the center of the rusted cathedral, his hands hovering inches from her face, terrified that if he touched her, she would dissolve into smoke. When his palms finally met the warmth of her skin, the contact was electric. She wasn't cold granite. She wasn't a memory. She was breathing, her heart a steady, defiant drum against his chest. "You're here," he choked out, his voice a broken wreck.
"How?"
Elena pulled him closer, her fingers interlacing with his, grounding them both in the cold metal heart of the mill. "The darkness tried to take me, Junho. But they forgot one thing." She looked up at him, her gaze as hard as the iron surrounding them. "You don't bury a queen until you're sure she's finished with her crown. We have work to do." The cold draft of the iron mill swirled around them, but the heat between their joined hands was the only thing Junho felt. He refused to let go, his thumb tracing the pulse point on her wrist as if to anchor her soul to the physical world. For a long moment, the silence was absolute, heavy with the weight of the years they had spent building a life that had almost ended in a porcelain cup of tea. Who was it? Junho's voice was no longer broken. It had sharpened into a low, predatory hum. The vulnerability of the cemetery was gone, replaced by the terrifying clarity of a man who finally had a target for his rage. Elena's expression didn't soften. She looked at him with a clinical, tactical gaze that reminded him why she had been his most trusted advisor before she was ever his wife. "The poison was in the tea, Junho. Prepared by Hannah, watched by Kenji. They didn't even wait for me to stop breathing before they started discussing how to manage you. They saw me as your heart, and they knew that if they cut it out, the Iron King would bleed until he was too weak to fight back." Junho's jaw tightened, the muscle leaping under his skin. The betrayal of blood was a familiar sting in their world, but Kenji was his own cousin, and Hannah had been the architect of their financial safety. "They think they've won," he murmured. "Kenji is sitting in my chair. Hannah is draining our reserves." "Let them think it," Elena replied, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that echoed off the rusted turbines. "They believe they are fighting a ghost and a broken widower. That is their greatest mistake. I have already begun dismantling Hannah's digital strongholds. She's staring at empty screens tonight, wondering why the dead are speaking to her." Junho looked at her, a dark, feral smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. The grief had been a cage, but this was a hunt. They want a new era? We'll give them one. But first, we'll make them lose their minds. I want them to jump at every shadow. I want them to fear the very air in the penthouse. Elena nodded, her eyes flashing with a shared, lethal purpose. "We haunt them for 7 days. We let the paranoia rot their alliance from the inside. And when they gather the clan heads to finalize their coup at the grand banquet, I will walk through the front doors. I want to see the blood drain from Kenji's face when he realizes that the grave couldn't hold what he tried to kill." Junho leaned in, pressing his forehead against hers, sealing the pact in the darkness of the mill. The mourning was over. The blood pact was reborn, forged in the fires of betrayal and tempered by the cold reality of the grave. They weren't just husband and wife anymore. They were the architects of a nightmare. 7 days, Junho promised. And then, we take it all back. The penthouse was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a hall of mirrors, a gilded cage where the silence felt predatory. Since Junho had retreated into a staged, silent mourning, Kenji had treated the sprawling residence like his personal war trophy. He paced the living room, a glass of amber scotch in hand, trying to ignore the prickling sensation at the back of his neck. He had won. The accounts were being consolidated, the clan heads were falling in line, and the Iron King was a broken ghost. But tonight, the shadows seemed to lean closer. Kenji entered the master suite, the room he intended to claim as his own by morning. He stopped dead. On the mahogany vanity, bathed in a sliver of moonlight, sat a single object that shouldn't have been there. It was a vintage silver bracelet, its camellia charms catching the light with a cold, metallic glint. He recognized it instantly. Elena had been wearing it the night she collapsed. He had seen it slide across the floor when she fell. His hand shook as he reached out, his fingers hovering over the cool metal. He had personally watched the coroner bag her personal effects. This was impossible. "Hannah," he barked into the empty hallway, but his voice was swallowed by the heavy velvet curtains. A few feet away, in the ensuite bathroom, the scent hit him, the sharp, floral top notes of expensive jasmine and sandalwood. It was her signature. The air was thick with it, as if she had just stepped out of the room. Trembling, Kenji pushed the frosted glass door open. The mirror was clouded with a faint, disappearing mist, and there, scrawled across the glass in a shade of deep, crimson lipstick, the exact shade Elena had favored for board meetings, was a single, jagged line. It wasn't a word. It was a mark, a reminder of a debt unpaid. The lipstick was still wet, a dark red bead trailing down the glass like a slow-moving tear. Kenji spun around, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The penthouse was sealed. The biometric locks were keyed only to him and Hannah. He checked the closet, pulling open the heavy doors only to find Elena's silk dresses hanging in a perfect, undisturbed row. But as the silk rustled, a small gold earring tumbled from the folds of a black gown, clinking softly onto the floorboards. He backed away, the scotch splashing over the rim of his glass. It was a haunting of the highest order, a psychological flaying that left no physical fingerprints. He wasn't looking at a ghost. He was looking at the cracks in his own reality. In the distance, a floorboard creaked, a light, rhythmic step that mimicked the cadence of a woman who knew these halls better than he ever would. Kenji bolted for the door, the silver bracelet still shimmering behind him, a silent witness to the beginning of his descent into madness. The hunt had moved from the iron mill to the heart of his home, and the dead were moving faster than he could breathe. The line between reality and the abyss had finally snapped for Kenji. He stood in the center of the syndicate's private lounge, the amber liquid in his glass sloshing over the sides as his hands shook with a rhythmic, uncontrollable tremor. For 3 days, he hadn't slept for more than an hour at a time. Every time his eyes closed, he felt the brush of silk against his skin. Every time he turned a corner, he caught the vanishing hem of a black dress. He looked into the darkened floor-to-ceiling windows of the lounge, and his heart stopped. In the reflection of the glass, standing directly behind him, was Elena. Her face was as calm and regal as it had been on the day of their wedding, her eyes fixed on his with a silent, devastating judgment. Kenji spun around, his glass shattering against the marble floor, but the corner was empty. Only the shadows of the designer furniture mocked him. "She's here, Hannah," Kenji roared, his voice cracking into a jagged, desperate high note. Hannah stood by the bar, her face a mask of cold, clinical exhaustion. She looked at the spilled scotch and then at the man who was supposed to be her ticket to the throne. To her, Kenji no longer looked like a king. He looked like a cornered animal, sweating through his expensive shirt, his eyes bloodshot and wild. "There is no one here, Kenji," Hannah said, her voice dripping with a dangerous contempt. "You're unraveling." The stress of the consolidation is making you see ghosts. If the clan heads see you like this tomorrow, they won't crown you. They'll put you in a cage. Kenji lunged forward, grabbing Hannah by the shoulders. His grip was frantic, his face inches from hers. Don't lie to me. You were the one who prepared the tea. You were the one who said the dose was lethal. Did you double-cross me? Did you give her a weaker dose, so you could keep her as your secret weapon against me? Hannah shoved him back, her eyes flashing with a lethal coldness. I am a strategist, not a fool. Elena is dead. If you're seeing her, it's because your conscience is a rotting organ. Or maybe you're the ghost, Kenji whispered, his paranoia finally turning inward, rotting the very foundation of their alliance. He looked at Hannah, and for a split second, her features seemed to shift, her skin darkening, her hair lengthening into the straight, black silk of the woman they had buried. He backed away, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. You want it all for yourself. You're gaslighting me so you can take Juno's seat alone. Hannah watched him, her hand moving instinctively toward the small, concealed blade in her waistband. The partnership was dead, dissolved by the very fear they had tried to use as a weapon. As Kenji retreated into the shadows of the hallway, muttering Elena's name like a prayer for mercy, Hannah realized that the haunting had succeeded. They weren't just fighting a memory anymore. They were destroying each other, exactly as the shadows intended. The grand banquet hall was a cathedral of glass and gold, a space designed to intimidate as much as to celebrate. Beneath the weight of massive crystal chandeliers, the table was set for the high-ranking heads of the global syndicates, the last supper of the old regime. Kenji sat at the head of the long obsidian table, his fingers nervously drumming against the silk tablecloth. Despite the fine cut of his suit and the presence of his armed loyalists lining the walls, he looked like a man sitting in an electric chair. Every time the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall creaked, he flinched, his eyes darting toward the shadows as if expecting a ghost to step into the light. Hannah sat to his right, her expression a mask of frozen steel. She had spent the last hour checking and rechecking her tablet, her mind a frantic blur of contingency plans. The digital haunting of the past week had left her nerves raw. She could still hear that low, melodic humming in the back of her mind, a phantom frequency she couldn't switch off. She looked at Kenji, disheveled, sweating, and barely holding onto his sanity, and felt a wave of cold revulsion. He was a weak link, a liability that was beginning to smell like a corpse. The clan heads are arriving, Hannah whispered, her voice devoid of warmth. Pull yourself together, Kenji. If they see you trembling like a child, they'll tear you apart before you can even propose the vote of no confidence. This is the moment we've worked for. By midnight, Juno will be a memory, and the throne will be yours. Kenji wiped his brow with a silk handkerchief, his breath coming in shallow, uneven hitches. Do you hear it, Hannah? The music? It's faint, but it's there. The same song from the penthouse. There is no music, Kenji, she hissed, her eyes flashing with a lethal warning. There is only the sound of your own cowardice. Drink your wine and be the man you claimed to be when you handed me that poison. The double doors swung open, and the clan heads began to file in, a procession of silver-haired titans and cold-eyed young wolves. The collective power of the underworld gathered to witness the official transition. They took their seats in a silence that was heavy and expectant, their gazes fixed on the empty chair at the opposite end of the table, Juno's chair. Kenji stood, his legs feeling like water. He raised his glass, the vintage red wine shimmering like fresh blood under the chandeliers. He opened his mouth to begin the final betrayal, to officially declare Juno unfit and crown himself the new sovereign. But as he looked out at the assembled elite, the lights in the hall flickered once, twice, and then plunged the entire room into a terrifying, absolute darkness. In the silence that followed, a single, soulful jazz note wailed through the speakers, and the air in the room suddenly turned thick with the scent of white lilies and expensive jasmine. The Last Supper had begun, but the traitors were the only ones on the menu. The darkness that swallowed the grand banquet hall was absolute, a sudden and violent erasure of the golden light that had, moments ago, promised Kenji his crown. In the void, the panicked breathing of the underworld's elite became a rhythmic, frantic percussion. No backup generators kicked in, no emergency lights flickered to life. It was as if the heavens themselves had looked down and decided the room no longer deserved to be seen. Kenji froze at the head of the table, his wine glass still raised, his heart thundering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Security," he shrieked, but his voice was thin, stripped of authority by the oppressive silence. Then the screens began to breathe. The massive high-definition displays that lined the hall, intended to show the new syndicate hierarchy, flickered with a ghostly, digital green. The static cleared, not into a menu or a logo, but into a grainy, high-angle view of the penthouse kitchen. The date stamp in the corner was 3 days old. The hall fell into a silence, so profound it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. On the screens, Hannah appeared, her movements precise and clinical. The clan heads watched enrapt, horrifying fascination as she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, amber vial. They watched as she carefully measured the clear liquid into a porcelain teacup, Elena's favorite cup. The audio was unnervingly sharp. The clink of the spoon against the rim sounded like a church bell in the quiet hall. "Is it done?" Kenji's voice rang out from the speakers, his recorded self stepping into the frame. "It's in the tea," the recorded Hannah replied, her face a mask of cold ambition. "Within 10 minutes, Juno's heart will be the only thing left of the old guard. Without her to steady him, he'll collapse. The transition will be seamless." The real Kenji backed away from the table, his boots scuffing against the marble, his face illuminated by the flickering light of his own treason. He looked at the clan heads, men who valued loyalty above life itself, and saw their expressions shifting from confusion to a cold, predatory judgment. "That's a lie," Kenji screamed, pointing a shaking finger at the screen. "That's a deepfake. Hannah, do something." But Hannah didn't move. She was staring at the screen where her own recorded image was now handing the cup to an off-screen Elena. The audio captured the soft, trusting "thank you, Hannah," of the woman they thought they had erased. The screen cut to black, but the silence didn't return. Instead, the heavy oak doors at the far end of the hall began to groan, the iron bolts sliding back with a slow, deliberate finality. The scent of white lilies and jasmine flooded the room, more potent than any perfume, as the soulful wail of a saxophone began to play through the hidden speakers. The heavens had gone silent so the world could finally hear the truth, and as the double doors began to swing inward, the traitors realized that the recording wasn't the end of the show, it was merely the opening act. The heavy oak doors of the grand banquet hall groaned on their hinges, swinging inward with a slow, cinematic deliberation that commanded every eye in the room. The scent of white lilies and jasmine, which had been a haunting whisper all week, now rushed in like a gale, thick enough to taste. For a heartbeat, the portal was a void of darkness, and then she stepped into the light. Elena Park was no longer a memory trapped in a silver frame or a name carved in cold granite. She moved through the threshold with the lethal grace of a predator returning to her territory. She was draped in a gown the color of dried blood, a deep, shimmering crimson silk that flowed around her legs like a liquid flame. Her hair was pulled back, sharp and regal, revealing a face that was devoid of mercy. She didn't look like a woman who had been buried. She looked like a goddess who had found the grave too small for her ambition. The silence in the hall was no longer just a lack of sound. It was a physical pressure. The clan heads, men who had seen every form of violence the world could offer, sat frozen, their forks and glasses suspended in midair. To them, she was the walking dead, a spectral anomaly that defied the laws of the underworld. Elena's heels clicked against the marble floor with a rhythmic, bone-chilling precision that mimicked the ticking of a clock. She didn't look at the assembled bosses. Her gaze was locked on the head of the table. As she passed the seats, the temperature in the room seemed to drop, the air crackling with the electric charge of her presence. Kenji's glass finally slipped from his numb fingers, shattering on the floor. He backed away until his spine hit the obsidian wall, his mouth working silently as he tried to form a word that wouldn't come. His eyes were wide, the pupils blown with a terror so absolute it bordered on madness. Hannah, beside him, was as pale as the lilies that filled the air, her hand clutching the edge of the table until her knuckles turned a ghostly white. Elena stopped at the foot of the table, directly opposite the traitors. She didn't scream or cast accusations. She simply stood there, bathed in the flickering glow of the monitors that still showed the evidence of their crime. The jazz music swelled, the saxophone wailing a mournful, triumphant note that signaled the end of the haunting. "You thought the earth was heavy enough to keep me down," Elena said, her voice low and resonant, carrying to every corner of the silent hall. She reached up, slowly smoothing the crimson silk over her hip, her eyes flashing with a cold, dark fire. "But you forgot, Kenji. I didn't just marry the Iron King. I helped him build the throne. And I've come to take my crown back." The heavy silence that had followed Elena's entrance was suddenly cut by a sound even more terrifying, the slow, rhythmic clapping of Junho Park. He stepped from the shadows behind the high-backed chairs, shedding his grief like a discarded skin. The man who had spent a week weeping in the dirt was gone. In his place stood a sovereign whose eyes were as flat and cold as the obsidian table. The disheveled, broken widower had been a mask, a masterclass in deception designed to lure the vipers out of their holes, and they had fallen for it with pathetic eagerness. Junho walked toward the head of the table, his presence expanding until he seemed to dwarf the very hall. He didn't look at the clan heads. He looked only at Kenji. The power in the room shifted instantly, the air vibrating with the lethal gravity of a man who is no longer mourning, but presiding over a court of execution. "You sat in my chair," Junho said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that carried the weight of a death sentence. "You toasted to my ruin while my wife's heart was still warm in her chest. You thought the Iron King had rested." Kenji scrambled backward, his hands pawing at the air as if to push away the inevitable. "Junho, wait, it was Hannah. She was the one who—" Junho didn't let him finish. With a movement so fast it was almost a blur, he reached out and gripped Kenji by the throat, hoisting him upward. The clan heads watched in frozen silence as Junho displayed the raw, terrifying strength that had built the syndicate. He leaned in, his face inches from his cousin's. "Blood only matters if it stays in the veins, Kenji. Yours has become a liability." With a flick of his wrist, Junho signaled his loyalists, who emerged from the periphery like shadows coming to life. Hannah tried to bolt for the side exit, her clinical composure finally shattered into 1,000 pieces of jagged terror, but she was intercepted before she could take 3 steps. The purge was swift, silent, and absolute. There were no pleas for mercy that Junho would hear, no negotiations to be made. He turned back to the clan heads, his hand resting on the back of his original chair. He looked at each of them, his gaze a challenge and a promise. "The era of doubt is over," he declared. The mourning was finished, the traitors were removed, and the Iron King had returned, not as a solitary ruler, but as half of a whole. He looked at Elena, standing in her crimson gown, and for the first time in a week, his face softened into something far more dangerous than grief, a smile of absolute, unified power. The purge was complete. Now, they would rebuild the world in their image. The storm had finally broken, leaving the air thin and smelling of whetstone and rebirth. The first light of dawn began to bleed across the horizon, painting the gray cemetery in shades of pale gold and bruised violet. Junho and Elena stood once more before the light gray granite monument, but the world had shifted on its axis since they were last here. The police lights were gone, the whispers of the traitors had been silenced, and the rest in peace. Engraving no longer felt like a sentence. It felt like a lie that needed to be erased. Junho stood with his feet planted in the mud, his ruined suit jacket discarded. In his grip, he held a heavy iron sledgehammer, its weight a familiar comfort. He looked at the black and white portrait of the woman who now stood breathing beside him. The crack in the upper left side of the stone was still there, a symbol of the tension that had nearly destroyed them. "This version of us is dead," Elena said softly, her voice steady as the morning light. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cold surface of the stone one last time. She wasn't looking at a grave anymore. She was looking at a cocoon they had outgrown. The woman they poisoned stays here. The man who wept in the dirt stays here. Junho nodded, his jaw set in a line of hard, polished steel. He swung the hammer in a wide, powerful arc. The sound of metal meeting granite was a thunderclap that echoed through the silent rows of the dead. A spiderweb of fractures erupted across the name Elena Park. He swung again, and again, each blow a violent rejection of the narrative their enemies had tried to write for them. Chunks of polished stone flew into the wet grass, the in-loving memory, text splintering into unrecognizable shards. With a final, guttural roar, Junho brought the hammer down on the center of the headstone, shattering the portrait and the granite plinth until nothing remained but a jagged pile of rubble. He dropped the hammer, his chest heaving with the exertion, the steam of his breath rising in the cool morning air. Elena stepped forward, interlacing her fingers with his. They stood over the debris of their own tragedy, no longer victims of a coup, but the architects of a dynasty. The sun climbed higher, illuminating the path back toward the iron gates where their car waited to take them back to the heart of the city. They didn't look back at the broken rocks. The Iron King and his queen walked out of the mist and into the living world, leaving the ghosts behind, ready to build an empire that would never again be vulnerable to the darkness of the shadows. Empires don't fall because of enemies outside the gate. They fall because of betrayal at the table. This story isn't just about power, revenge, or a throne built on iron. It's about perception. About how easily we mistake grief for weakness, silence for surrender, and love for vulnerability. Kenji and Hannah believed that if they struck the heart, the kingdom would collapse. But they forgot something powerful. A true bond doesn't shatter under pressure. It transforms. Junho's tears were not the end of a king. They were the rebirth of one. Elena's silence was not death. It was strategy. If you enjoyed this cinematic story of power, betrayal, and rebirth, and you want more high-stakes drama like this, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next empire that rises or the next king who refuses to fall. This is only the beginning. Thanks for staying with us. Stay blessed and stay beautiful.